Some fun, yeah, fun.
So, welcome everyone. So, a few months ago, Adam, our esteemed director, asked me to invite someone. So why me? Because I am at Egenis. I'm the lead for EDI. So, diversity inclusion initiatives. So first thing to notice then is that if you have any issues about diversity inclusion and those very important issues, please come talk to me at any point, right? Second of all, then this means that I do a few activities throughout the year. One of them is to invite someone to talk about the intersection of diversity and science or related issues. And the first person I'm inviting is Captain Elliott. One reason why I'm inviting Captain is because he was really important to me a few years ago. So imagine yourself during the pandemic, you are giving a talk online, you don't know how it's gonna go. No people in the PSA knew what was gonna go. So PSA was for the first time putting together a session in organization with the minorities in philosophy group, which is a very important group around the world. So they did that, I was there, I was giving a talk. After everything, Kevin sent a very generous email and we started a conversation. I'm mentioning this just to say how important for early careers is to have people reaching out and being generous and reading, taking your work seriously, right? I think that's actually the main reason why I invited Kevin. Despite all that, he's also, let me take the list, he's a Red Center Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University. So, in the last 10 years, there is this huge proliferation of philosophers talking about values in science in a more concrete way, drawing from previous traditions in feminist philosophy of science, etc. Kevin is one of the main names in this very prolific literature. So he edited very important books like the inductive exploring inductive risk. That was 2017, right? Very important book. Recommend everyone to look at that. But he also has his own important monographs. So I would highlight the Tapestry of Values, an Introduction to Values in Science. This is also from 2017. If you want a very sweet, short introduction to values in science, especially for the classroom, I suggest his Cambridge Elements called Values in Science. So without further ado, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us. It would be awesome. Take it away.
Really appreciate the invitation. I think you've got such a great group here at Exeter, so this is a treat. And it's actually also helpful because I think this is I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm sort of in the early stages of. And so I think the kind of interesting multidisciplinary crew that you've got here, I'm hoping to get some useful advice. So anyway, so in terms of what I'd like to do with the talk, I want to first just provide a little bit of background on values and science and this sort of idea of standardized methodological rules or norms that I'm wanting to think about a little bit more in this project. And then I want to think a little more about just spend some time thinking about the benefits and disadvantages of kind of standardizing methodological approaches. And then talk a little bit about, as a US citizen, I guess I'm thinking a lot about troubled times right now. And so I'm kind of connecting up, sort of my reading of the news a little bit with some of these thoughts. And then I want to get into a more concrete case study. Some of you may know, I think a lot about toxicology. And so I want to look at a case study. And I think it's going to support, I think, some of my suggestions about standardization in troubled times and offer an opportunity to think a little bit more about sort of how standardizing of methodological rules and norms play out. So that's where I'm headed. Let me start with some background. And my personal motivation here, actually, part of it comes from, some of you may know Justin Biddle. I realized it's been 25 years now since we met in graduate school. And for most of that time, he's been saying, those of us thinking about values in science really need to think more at an institutional or organizational level and not just get caught up in, thinking about individual scientists and values. And then when my Tapestry of Values book came out, that it's also mentioned, there was kind of a symposium about it, and Heather Douglas, who's played a really important role in this literature, said, when we think about tapestries, we need to think about looms. How is this tapestry generated? And so we need to think more about the institutional and cultural frameworks that structure science. So I thought, yes, I need to take that seriously. And then Chris Monsavinos has this paper in the European Journal of Philosophy, where he says, discussions about values in science have been missing the institutional dimension. So all these people that I respect have been saying, we need to think more institutionally about values in science. And so that's part of, my motivation right now, trying to move in this direction. And so if we think about kind of broadly the institutional environment of science, here, feel free to share stuff. There's a lot of things that we could think about. So, we can be thinking about organizations like universities in which science is taking place, companies that are doing science, funding agencies, NGOs. We could be thinking about kind of rules and norms that guide scientific practice, various conventions and legal and moral rules, various norms of disciplines or groups. We could be thinking more about like the infrastructure in which science is, sort of empowering science, and the context in which science is playing out. So anyway, there's all this stuff that we could think about, and so I'm trying to think. So where do I enter in here a little bit more, thinking about values and science issues? And again, we could just draw all sorts of connections. I've just been kind of interested in thinking a little bit more like about sort of the rules and norms that guide scientist practices. And so in this talk, I want to think especially about, again, this still ends up being really broad, rules and norms and conventions for study design, for data collection, data analysis, interpretation, reporting, reporting of findings, standards of evidence. So this is, still a huge topic, but I want to think especially about these rules or norms or conventions that guide methodologies. And then we can think then about how these are embedded in all of this other stuff, but I'm just trying to bring a little bit of focus to, this, to my efforts here. So when we think about these methodological rules or norms or conventions, why is this worth studying? Well, I think that in science and values, if you look at some of the literature, kind of a key starting point for most of us is saying, look, scientists are making all sorts of contingent methodological choices about, again, what questions they ask, how they design their studies, how they analyze their results. And these choices end up having these often subtle impacts on society. And so, this is a point that Matt Brown makes in his book, Science and Moral Imagination. It's a point that I make. And so there can be a temptation to then sort of think, okay, well, what's the role of values here? To say, okay, well, we can think about scientists and values heads, or values in scientists' heads that drive these choices. And maybe we want to encourage scientists to think in a more ethically, socially rich fashion about this. But realistically, methodological rules and norms are playing a huge role in how these choices play out. And so this is what I want to think about a little bit more, sort of how do these methodological rules, norms, conventions guide these choices that we've been thinking about in science and values. So I'm not very creative at drawing figures, so this is my effort to don't make too much fun of this. But we can think about, we've got a scientist here. They're making all these choices in their research, about questions and study design and interpretation and standards of evidence. And the values in science literature has been saying, hey, we need to look at all the interesting, subtle ways in which this has impacts on the world. And again, so scientists have values in their heads, perhaps some of the time, We could enrich this a little bit more and say, look, scientists' values are informed by their experiences in the world, and these choices are impacting other people's values as well. And so there's this interesting back and forth. But what I want to emphasize is that, I think that one of the things that we could do better in this literature is to think about all these other kinds of norms and rules and guidelines that are informing these choices that get made, whether it be policies in journals or funders, or science being done in an industry context, or other kinds of rules and guidelines and norms within teams. So I think there's a lot of richness that we could explore here in terms of impacting these choices that get made. And that's kind of the direction that I'd like to be thinking about with this project. So then this raises the question about standardization. How should we feel about these kinds of rules or norms? Is this a good thing to have these sort of constraining scientist choices? Should we be resisting this? Should we try to give scientists as much freedom as possible to do their own thing? And of course, there's some nice STS literature that I'm trying to get into a little bit more on this. I still need to read a lot more, so I welcome suggestions for literature that I should look at, because I am in the early stages here. And so, Timmermans and Epstein here define standardization as a process of constructing uniformities across time and space through the generation of agreed upon rules. So the thought is, how should we feel about this kind of process of constructing uniformities, say, in how scientists are making these value-laden choices? Should we be enthusiastic about this, or should we be resisting this kind of standardization from the perspective of scientist choices and their impacts on society? So I think if we think about this kind of standardization, it raises some new questions for the literature on values in science. So, you can think about a lot of the work that's been done so far is we've been thinking, okay, well, how do we handle various individual cases where value-laden choices need to be made? We've been thinking about, okay, there are these subtle choices in study design, or the ways in which results are communicated, or the ways in which scientific results are interpreted. And this is where a lot of our attention has been. But I think that if we start thinking about standardization, it raises a whole bunch of interesting questions for those of us working in this area. So should we try to standardize across similar cases? And I was thinking about this actually at the workshops also. When we were talking about this on Friday, for those of you who didn't know, Celso's got this great project, the Fujera project. And some of the speakers were talking about a National Academy of Sciences report that was offering advice to researchers working on issues of race about what kinds of concepts to use, whether to focus on race or ancestry or genetic similarity. Well, this is an example, in a sense, of the National Academies offering some kind of standardized advice on how to approach these questions. So it's kind of an interesting example. And so then we can ask questions like, well, when is this a useful thing to have this kind of standardization? When is it not useful? What kinds of rules? Do we want these to be more formal or informal? How specific do we want these kinds of rules to be? How broad should their scope be? Do we want to be recommending particular approaches, or how much do we want to be encouraging scientists to deviate from these kinds of rules or norms? What are the best ways of creating or enforcing or revising these? So loads of kind of interesting questions that could be explored that we surely need to think about in a kind of contextual way. So I'm just kind of entering into starting this, and I very much welcome your thoughts on different promising directions to go. So this is my background. So what I want to do in the remainder of the talk is just kind of get started thinking a little bit about the existing literature on the benefits and disadvantages of this kind of methodological standardization, so we can explore a little bit more how this might play out in particular cases, and then offer a case study so we can think about this with a little more concreteness, because surely this is going to depend a lot from case to case, how we approach this kind of standardization. Okay, so I want to just spend some time kind of looking at some of the interesting literature that we could bring to bear on these questions. And I want to start, there's this really nice paper that Torsten Wilholt published back in 2009 on bias and values in scientific research. And he was responding to the kind of the some of the literature on standards of evidence and inductive risk, and the idea that one could reasonably make different choices in terms of how much evidence one wanted to demand in order to draw conclusions. And he says that in response to these kinds of choices, where you could reasonably demand different standards of evidence, he said conventions are really important for being able to sort of specify what counts as biased analysis. He says, because scientists are making a lot of choices that can reasonably be handled in different ways, like standards of evidence, he says it's not very straightforward to criticize scientists and say, hey, you're displaying a kind of preference bias, making choices because you want to get particular results, because there is this kind of looseness in terms of analysis. And he said he thinks that conventional standards really play a crucial role in assessing scientists' choices. You set particular conventional standards, like a 95% statistical significance level. And so then you can say, okay, we as a community have agreed on these conventional standards. And then we can say when you're deviating from these, that then you're exhibiting bias. And he talks a little bit in his paper about conventions for experimental design, conventions for reporting, and conventions for significance testing. So this is one, sort of potential benefit of standardization, that you provide this kind of starting point that everybody agrees on to then identify bias as the deviation from it. So I'm going to be coming back to this later in the talk. Another kind of building on Wilhold's point is that this also helps with coordination and communication. And Stephen John sort of builds on this further in this paper that he wrote back in 2015, where, so Wilhold's kind of especially thinking about communication and coordination within the scientific community. If everybody knows like what the expectations are for standards of evidence or study design, then the scientists can work more successfully together. But John says, well, what about with the broader public? He says, again, thinking about these issues of like, how much evidence should you have in order to make claims? He says, if scientists adopt uniform high epistemic standards, well, then everybody in society knows, okay, if a scientist is making some claim, then I can probably rely on that, because whatever my values might be, I know that the scientists had very high standards of evidence. So if they actually accepted it, I can rely on those claims for my purposes. And so this is another possible benefit of this kind of standardization, being able to communicate more effectively. I also think that it could be helpful for kind of less cognitive overload on the part of individual scientists. This is a point I kind of touch on in my Tapestry of Values book, where somebody might worry, yeah, you philosophers are telling scientists they should be thinking about the value-laden aspects of their work, but scientists are thinking about a lot of stuff. They got a lot of pressures. Can they really think through all this like social ramification business you want them to think about? And so I know that in the book that you could be thinking about handling these value-laden choices more at the individual level or the community level. And I was kind of hinting in this direction. It seems easier to justify having groups of scientists make these value-laden decisions than have individual scientists trying to do so. So this kind of comes back to that National Academy of Science report again. You might think, rather than having a bunch of individual scientists think through, okay, well, should I be talking about genetic similarity? Should I be talking about ancestry? Should I be using race in these contexts? Having a group of scientists sit down and talk with some folks from other disciplines, they may be able to do a better job in handling these issues. So you might say having like teams or networks or societies think about how to make these kinds of methodological choices might get you better decisions and just be less overwhelming for these scientists trying to make choices in responsible ways. I also think it could help with addressing like one of the classic worries. So some of the key folks like Gregor Betz, who have tried to resist kind of abandoning a value-free ideal for science, they're very worried about the potential for paternalism. The thought is if scientists are bringing ethical or social values into their work, doesn't that sort of in some ways impose their values on the rest of society? And that could be a problem. And so if you standardize various kind of key value-laden choices, then it may make it easier to get some sort of broader consent to how those choices are made. Whereas if individual scientists are just making all these choices on their own, you can't it's much more difficult to get broader consent. So a nice example to this is I was recently talking to a scientist at the European Chemicals Agency. And we were talking, actually, I was mentioning this in the discussion with the grad students and postdocs before this, where we were talking about the shift to non-animal studies. And they were actually sort of lamenting a little bit about how difficult it is for them to make that change, because you actually have the REACH legislation that's pretty prescriptive about the kinds of studies that they should depend on in order to like approve chemicals. But you might say, in a sense, this is good. It kind of is less paternalistic because you have this democratic process where the European, I don't understand how all the European politics work, but basically you've got folks who make these decisions on behalf of the people of Europe and saying, this is how you should make your decisions about approving, chemicals. So anyway, having that kind of standardization, as opposed to just letting the scientists at ECHA just kind of, say, yeah, I think these studies provide enough evidence to approve. Maybe it's a little bit less paternalistic. And then also, there's some really nice work that Gwen Ottinger has done. This is a really cool paper that she wrote, where she was working with communities in the US state of Louisiana, where you have these folks living in fence line communities near industrial facilities, and they didn't trust what the companies were saying about the emissions from their industrial facilities reasonably, and they weren't really trusting what the government, the state of Louisiana said, because the state of Louisiana is very sympathetic to their chemical industry. And so people would actually collect samples, air samples, like in these sort of like makeshift buckets with these plastic bags. They actually talk about bucket brigades. It's like a citizen science effort. And anyway, she talked about how they were able to get more uptake of their people gaining credibility for their samples because they sent them to government-approved labs that analyze the samples in standardized ways. And so it's a way of then, if communities can do things in ways that meet the standards, then they can get respect for their work. So I think that's also really interesting. Unfortunately, this also kind of shifts us to the disadvantages, because Ottinger also points out that sometimes when you have kind of standardized rules or norms for how to do things in place, and communities want to do things differently, well, then they get sabotaged by not doing things that way. So another thing she points out is these communities would say, hey, we collected these samples, we're seeing these high levels of air pollution, this is a problem. And the regulators would say, oh, sorry, you don't really understand. Really, pollution is supposed to be analyzed over like at least 48 hours or a week or two. And so this just isn't meaningful data. These spikes don't mean anything. And I mean, legitimately, the people might say, well, maybe there's some problems with those standards. Maybe these spikes in pollution are harmful to us, but then they have to try to fight against these standardized rules. So this is a potential worry. Thinking of other worries, I think it's a sign of Stephen John's quality as a dissertation advisor that he supported his student, Ahmed Elabar, in giving him a hard time. That Ahmed said, Stephen, you were saying that it's good for society to have these uniform high standards of evidence, but maybe this actually results in injustice. Now, Ahmed's been doing awesome work looking at the IPCC, studying climate change, and he says that what can happen is the IPCC will set these high standards for the data to be used in reports. And so then say you have parts of the world that don't have that kind of data, well then, because of their high standards, they can't really do much in assessments for those areas. They don't come up with many findings because they just don't have the level of data that they're expecting. And so he says, maybe it's not such a great move to be expecting scientists to have these uniform high epistemic standards of evidence. Maybe we need to vary our standards because of considerations of justice. Another worry that you all have had plenty of interaction with Sabina Leonelli over the years. She's been saying some really nice things about, say, standardization in open science context, and saying when you have various open science databases and you're kind of standardizing the information, in particular ontologies and categories, then you lose epistemic diversity. And this is a point that other people have been making in this context. Steve Elliott and Beckett Sterner, say that you kind of lose diversity of taxonomic approaches when you're kind of forcing everything into this kind of categorization. And Carlos Santana has also been talking about this in the context of open science, that you kind of have these ways you say, okay, here's how information should be reported, and then you lose relevant details and context. Also, you can kind of, I think, lose expert judgment when you have these kinds of rules or norms for how things should be done. A lot of you may be familiar with T. Wynn's really interesting work. He talks about this in the context of transparency, but I think his worries apply to standardization more broadly. So this is just a really fun quotation. I couldn't resist including it here. He says, if you're forcing reason into the explicit and public sphere, then it can be good. You root out corruption, back to our first point about bias, but it also inhibits the full application of expert skill and sensitivity. He says, if we leash groups of experts, he puts it so nicely, to pursuing only the goals and taking only the actions that can be justified to the non-expert public. So that's the transparency part. But I think you could make the same point about standardization. If you're forcing them to only make the kinds of judgments that follow these prescribed rules or norms, then you actually undermine their expertise. So really interesting point he makes. And then just further on this point, I had some really good conversations with Matt Brown, and he said, yeah, the standardization is bad news. And let me tell you all the reasons. So I'll give you Matt's insights. He says, look, he wrote this book, Science and Moral Imagination. He's trying to help scientists be more morally imaginative. And he says, if you're standardizing how they handle these choices, then they're losing these insights of this moral judgment. He says they're going to become lazy and dogmatic. They're not going to be creative and critical thinkers in addressing these judgments in science. He said you could even go back and think about like act versus rule utilitarianism. And you're either going to get overly rigid, or you need to like give the scientists the freedom to make the choices, individually. He also said you could even draw some comparisons to like biomedical ethics. And like principlist approaches to biomedical ethics that sort of kind of a top-down approach. He says, as a pragmatist, Matt says, we need to think in more of a rich bottom-up case-based way and not have this kind of rule-governed standardized approach. And finally, he said, look, go back to Feyerabend. If you want to really have progress, you need to let the scientists violate supposed rules or norms. So Matt said, look, Kevin, standardization not good. Also, there can be the worry of losing innovation. This is a point that I actually made about 10 years ago, where I was looking at toxicology. I'll say a little bit more about this, but you can kind of lock in potentially outdated design approaches, and then it's hard to change these later on. And sometimes you can have powerful vested interests who like the current approach and don't want to be using like the latest new approaches. And so they can just sort of keep you using older approaches that aren't as good. Again, we were talking earlier about animal methods, moving away from animal research. And this was a piece in Nature earlier this year where some early career researchers said, look, the kinds of studies we want to do, we don't need to be using animal studies, but because of various requirements of journals we're trying to publish in or grants, we're having to go ahead and use these animal studies even when it's not necessary. So it's like a perfect example of how you put in place certain norms or standards, and then it sabotages innovation. Okay, so I just did a lot of talking about benefits and disadvantages, so let's just maybe summarize. So we saw Vilholt says, hey, this can be a way to clearly delineate what counts as appropriate and inappropriate scientific work. This can help us with communication, Stephen John says, if you have straightforward, uniform standards. Maybe it can help to address choices better without cognitive overload for scientists. And maybe it'll be less paternalistic because you can have some sort of like process for broader social deliberation about your standards. It might help communities to be able to get respect for their science. but it could also make it more difficult for communities in some cases. Ahmed tells us, there's going to be the potential for injustice here. Sabina and company says, yeah, you're going to lose epistemic diversity. You've got folks like Wynn and Brown saying you're going to lose expert judgment, and we are going to limit innovation and potentially get this co-opted by vested interests in the process. So I kind of was looking at all this summer and thinking, well, what do I say now? It's a real mess of possible benefits and disadvantages. And so in terms of trying to move forward, this was my question. And so I think, admittedly, we probably need to be fairly contextual and think about, how this plays out in various contexts. I think one thought is to look for, are there cases where, particular benefits of standardization are particularly salient or important, or maybe combinations of benefits, or you could flip it around the other way where the disadvantages are particularly striking. And then, if we think the benefits are particularly significant in some cases, are there ways to lessen the disadvantages? So this is kind of the direction I've been going in trying to pursue this project. And so I want to kind of talk this through a little bit with you. And so as I was thinking about this, trying to figure out, well, what are the conditions under which standardization might be particularly beneficial? I was reading the news in the US and I was thinking, well, I think there's some implications here. I think that one context, getting back to calling out bias, in which the benefits of standardization may be particularly salient, is when you have scientists or other social actors operating irresponsibly or in bad faith. So I started just kind of taking notes on, sort of things I was seeing in the news. So I think being able to clearly delineate bias in these cases is really important. So for example, this summer we were seeing that Trump didn't like the numbers coming out of the Department of Labor on job numbers and said, okay, these numbers are rigged. We got to fire the person in charge of this. This is bad news. And then, he proposed this, really politically motivated person to, be in charge. I think that this actual nomination didn't actually pan out. So at least one decent thing maybe happened. But anyway, this was really worrisome that, when you've got a government that just, throws out numbers that they don't like. Then, you had, of course, the US Department of Energy, putting out this new report on, sort of impacts of climate change in terms of policy making that really departed from the scientific consensus. And then the National Academy of Sciences was concerned about this. And so they, put in place plans to generate a pretty rapid report to kind of evaluate this proposal from the Department of Energy. And so then that made the US House of Representatives really irritated. And they said, well, the National Academies had started to produce partisan studies, and they started like telling, government agencies to be careful about paying attention to what the National Academies was saying. So this was just a news piece in Science where they talked about the National Academies, going back to Civil War times. And then you had these congressional committees saying, yeah, be careful about listening to the National Academies. They noted that part of the reason was they were really irritated about this National Academy study that was looking at anthropogenic greenhouse gases and how that affected public health, and sort of the clashing of that with what the Environmental Protection Agency was wanting to say. And just in general, they said that we want government agencies to be cautious about contracting with the National Academies. We're not so sure that they're actually doing objective, nonpartisan research anymore. So anyway, you've got these, you're kind of losing this ability to appeal to the National Academies as a source of information. And then, of course, we've got the Centers for Disease Control and Robert Kennedy, leaders being fired because of sort of the fact that she didn't want to pre-approve the vaccine recommendations that Robert F. Kennedy was making. So anyway, the point is, I could go on. I have this whole file of, depressing anyway, but the point is, so, we've got all this weird stuff going on. And so in these kinds of times where you've got all these questions about, what counts as nonpartisan work, what kinds of science we can rely on, Wilholt's points about having kind of clear standards can be really helpful for trying to delineate this when you've got a lot of confusion. And so I would also note that it's not just politics. What we've actually seen lots of discussion from historians and philosophers and sociologists of science in recent years is the ways in which, say, the tobacco industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and fossil fuel industry, chemical industry will also, be, seeking to manipulate science, produce science that serves their purposes. And so again, you've got these questions of how do we delineate, sort of appropriate and inappropriate scientific activity. And so I think that that in these kinds of troubled times, it can be really helpful to have standardized methodological rules or norms. And so now I want to finally, you all are being very patient, hanging in there with me. So I want to then kind of conclude by looking at a case study. So I'm kind of suggesting it sure seems like standardization can be helpful in these contexts. So let's look at a case study, kind of see how it plays out in practice. All right, and so I, have found regulatory toxicology to be, sort of a case that I know a bit about already, and so that's what I want to sort of look at. So it's actually super interesting. I don't know if any of you have heard of this scandal, but it's really wild. If you want to read more, there's this piece that came out a couple of years ago in the American Journal of Public Health. But there was this lab, the Industrial Biotest Lab, or IBT, that was doing a huge amount of toxicity testing for the US in the 1970s. So of the studies being submitted to like the FDA or the EPA, 35 to 40% of these toxicology studies were coming out of this lab. And then they ended up finding out that the conditions were a disaster. There was, you ultimately had these executives convicted of fraud. You had these situations where they actually had like wild rats that had gotten in and were mating with the animals. You had like dead animals that I didn't really want to put up a quotation here, but like they talked about like decomposing, through these cages, and it was just nuts. And so they had terrible data, and so they were just like making up data sometimes. And these were the folks producing these toxicity studies for the federal government. So just absolutely wild. And so after this, the FDA realized, whoa, maybe we need to standardize things a little bit more. And so they created these good laboratory practice, or GLP standards. So if companies were going to submit studies for regulatory purposes, they had to meet these standards. And these really focused a lot on like record keeping and reporting. So you really had to document what went on with, studies. You had to have standard operating procedures, facility inspections, careful equipment calibration. So just very careful auditing of what went on. So you couldn't just have people making up data anymore. And then this kind of got combined with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, developed like test guidelines. So if you would be doing, so like say back to ECHA, if they are making decisions about, whether to approve chemicals, they would say, okay, we want to see these kinds of studies that the OECD has approved. And in order to do those studies, you're supposed to use these animals, this speed, this length of study, here's the data that you're supposed to report, even, advice on interpreting the results. So you've got like very careful reporting and very careful guidelines on how to do the studies. And so, this, you can see how then this makes it much more difficult for companies like IBT to just, do crazy stuff and make a mess of things. So, you can see how standardization was very helpful for kind of preventing problems like we saw in the 1970s with IBT. But we can also see here in this case some of the interesting disadvantages of standardization. So there's an interesting piece. Thomas Hartung is a famous toxicologist at Johns Hopkins, very influential, promoting what he would call evidence-based toxicology, kind of like drawing on evidence-based medicine, trying to move away from animal studies. And so he tells the story in this piece in Nature that, at one point toxicology was really pretty cool. It was developing in promising ways. We were, developing this patchwork of testing approaches, but then all of a sudden fewer and fewer scientific developments were incorporated. And then I love this, a really fun comparison. He says, the system of regulatory toxicology fell asleep, much like the fairy tale character Snow White, when she bit into the poisonous apple. And he says in the case of toxicology, the poison was international guidelines. Having these standardized guidelines, he said, just made it too difficult to then like move the field forward. And he says that, this was tempting, not only in order to prevent bias, but because then the goal of the OECD was also that then you could do a study and all the countries of the world would accept the study. It was kind of, it made things really straightforward and simple. But he says, then it was so slow to get everybody internationally in the OECD to accept these guidelines that it became too difficult to change them. So again, you got this key point here that having these standardized guidelines agreed upon internationally just really made it difficult to move the field forward. And you can kind of see this in a case study. I don't know if any of you have followed the debates about bisphenol A. BPA, it's this a plasticizer. It's in so it was in a lot of plastic bottles. There were debates about it in baby bottles. At least in the US, it's in all kinds of receipts and can liners and things like that. And so for years, you had academic scientists saying, it sure seems like we're seeing worrisome effects of BPA at really pretty realistic levels of exposure that people are exposed to in our studies. They said, this is a serious problem. We need to be taking BPA out of stuff. And, but industry and the regulatory scientists, like at the European Food Safety Authority and the FDA, said, we're really not convinced. The studies that we're seeing done according to the OECD guidelines aren't really showing harmful effects. The academics say, well, that's because these are old studies or old, test guidelines. They're not good at picking up endocrine disrupting effects that our new cool academic studies can do. And so they published a bunch of academics published this piece back in 2009 in this prominent environmental health journal, where they said, look, it's dumb that the FDA and the European Food Safety Authority are depending on these good laboratory practices, OECD studies. These just aren't sensitive at picking up these kinds of endocrine disrupting effects that we're seeing. Meanwhile, industry came back and said, yeah, you academics, you're like the Wild West. You do all kinds of new stuff, and we don't know if we can really trust these studies. They haven't been validated. They haven't gone through this consensus process. And so you say you're seeing all this. And again, it's really striking. In this paper, they point out that 90% of the academic studies were showing harmful effects, and none of the industry-funded studies were. So it was pretty dramatic in terms of how things were playing out. So anyway, this gets back to kind of the paper that I wrote back in 2016, that it's so slow to change these standards in this regulatory context that, and then the polluters say, hey, we're fine with using these older study approaches. It's not picking up harmful effects. Great, let's stick with it. And so anyway, the OECD has this kind of complicated process where it's not a very open decision-making process. It's mostly representatives of these various governments around the world. And there's kind of the sense that industry can often, sort of do some back channel lobbying, but it's not like you got civil society organizations that are hanging out at the OECD having a say in how this process plays out. So you've got the issue of it being slow to change, and then you got to think about, okay, who actually has power over this change-making process? Okay. And then one other point that I'll just make is that there are some interesting issues with how these methodological rules then not only play out in the science itself, but kind of interface with other aspects of society. So Carl Kraner has done a lot of, he's a philosopher who writes about law and regulatory science associated with toxicology. And so a point that he makes in a lot of his work is that you get these weird relationships between sort of the standards in science and then how it plays out in a legal context, where he says that, say scientists are used to these high standards of evidence, with particular, ways of analyzing data in science. And he says in the law, if you're suing somebody in a tort suit, you're only supposed to need to show a preponderance of evidence that's just over 50% that they harmed you. But he says that this is just ripe for confusion because, say polluters, the defendants, can kind of use typical scientific standards to sort of, get scientists to say, well, no, I guess we're not that convinced, or judges to say, no, the evidence isn't that great that this, that you've actually been harmed by particular chemicals. And so it's like tricky to shift from appropriate scientific standards to the appropriate legal standards. I won't bore you with the details, but he's also talked about how, just from a social perspective, when we're wanting to make decisions about like whether to regulate chemicals, it would often make sense to depend on less stringent norms or standards of evidence than we typically find in science. So he says, look, this like social interface between the standards used in science and what plays out in the law or in social decision making is just rife with complexities and confusions. And so you can have these methodological norms that then cause problems in other contexts. So coming down to the end here, I just want to pull a few lessons out of the case study. So I do think that we can see here how having some like standardized methodological rules or norms can be helpful for kind of delineating appropriate and inappropriate science. But at least in this case, we can see how we can avoid some of the disadvantages if we have like opportunities for deviating from the rules. Like, we don't want these to be too locked in place without opportunities for deviation, as we saw like with the academic scientists who said, look, you ought to pay some attention to these other kinds of studies that we're doing. And we can also see how we can get ourselves in trouble if we're too slow to be able to revise the standards and if we're not considering the social context. So I just want to do two more slides, one about deviation and one revision, just to kind of maybe get some thoughts, flowing for the Q&A. So in terms of deviation, I think, especially when we think about like the issues raised by Craner, that I'm wondering if sometimes we can have our cake and eat it too, at least in cases like this, where you have the standards in place, but allowing deviation from the standards if people are clear about why they're doing so. And so, if we think back to that BPA case, I think if we could have had a little more respect for the academic studies, then you could, in a sense, say, okay, here, we've got these guidelines, but if you can give good reasons why your academic studies make sense, well, then maybe the regulatory agencies can take them on board. And interestingly, the European Food Safety Authority finally did say, yeah, we think you folks are right. And they dramatically changed their regulation of BPA. The US still sticking with the old approach, as you could probably expect. So this is an interesting study, actually, where a group of toxicologists said, let us help you academics. If we give you some guidelines for like how to report your studies, then we think that the regulatory agencies can give them more weight. So the thought is, clearly be transparent about what you're doing, how it deviates from the normal standards, and then maybe we can get some more uptake for these academic studies, even if they're not following the guidelines. So just a few further thoughts that we could think about. I think that, if Sabina were here, she would probably point out that like when you have standards for like an open science database, it's probably harder to deviate from those. It's like you're more locked in. With these toxicology studies, it's probably a little easier to deviate and do things differently. So we need to consider in different contexts, it's going to be more difficult to deviate than others. And then we also probably want to think about the fact that maybe some methodological rules are just really like crucial and basic, like not committing fraud or falsifying. And so maybe those you don't allow deviation from. And then maybe other choices are like complex and you don't want to standardize at all. So maybe there's this sweet spot where you want to really have the standards but allow deviation. I don't know, we can think more. And then I also acknowledge that when you do allow deviation, then you got to decide, okay, well, like how much weight are we going to give to, how much respect are we going to give to these approaches that deviate? Like you say, yeah, communities, you can do some community science that deviates from the standards, but then we got to figure out like how seriously we take that. So there's a lot of questions we need to explore here. Okay, last slide before my conclusion. I also think we need to think about like, how do we sort of have a revision process that avoids these worries that Hartung and Kramer and I mentioned of just like stagnating, getting stuck in approaches. I think in this case study, it's really interesting to consider the non-epistemic issues, the ways in which like co-optation of standards could play out. And also like thinking about how these methodological standards that we may set up because we think it works well in science, then can like not work so well in the broader society or a legal context or so on. So we need to think about the broader impacts. And so ideally, we would like, be thinking, okay, how easy do we want it to be to revise these standards given the scientific and social context? But I acknowledge this gets really tough because you might say, all right, we have these standards, they were too locked in place at the OECD. We've got to make it easier and have more nimble decision making. But then I'm saying, well, we should be considering these non-epistemic issues. So you could say, well, that's going to be a mess. It's going to be really slow to bring everybody's insights to bear on this. And so, I acknowledge there are difficult tensions. These are just things I'm exploring right now. I will note there's this interesting interplay between the deviation and the revision issue. So like, if you allow folks to deviate from the rules, maybe it's not so crucial to have a quick revision process. Whereas if you're not letting people deviate, well, then maybe you need to be more nimble about being able to revise them. So I think there's some interesting things we could think about there. Okay, so thank you all for sticking around to the end here. You got the basic issue of what I did, tried to sort of think a little bit about the pros and cons of sort of standardizing these value-laden choices in science, and then reflect a little bit on how it played out in regulatory toxicology. So again, this is kind of the early stages. This is my first case study to kind of think about here. And so it would be great to get your insights and advice. Thank you all.